The Porsche arrived on a Wednesday morning, hauled in on a flatbed from somewhere south of the city. Grant Mercer watched it come off the ramp from the open bay door of his garage. He wiped his hands on a rag that hadn't been cleaned since Tuesday and didn't move from where he was standing. The car was a 9111 Turbo S, Atlantic blue metallic, and even sitting dead on a flatbed, it looked like it was moving. It also looked like someone had spent a lot of money trying to fix it and had not succeeded. The woman who stepped out of the black Escalade behind the flatbed was the kind of woman who made small towns feel smaller. Fitted charcoal coat, heels that had no business being in a gravel lot in November, the kind of composure that came from a lifetime of being the most prepared person in the room. She looked at the garage, the hand-painted sign, the two older bays, the modest parts shelves visible through the window. And she didn't say anything, but Grant had been reading faces since he was a child, and he read hers just fine. Her name was Victoria Ashworth. She was the CEO of Ashworth Capital, a private equity firm with offices in Toronto and Vancouver, and she had not driven out to a town of 4,000 people in the Grey County Hills because she wanted to. She was here because her assistant had exhausted every other option. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Not a question. She'd done her research, at least that much. "That's me," Grant said. She looked at the Porsche on the flatbed and then back at him. "How long will this take?" He almost smiled. He didn't, but almost. "I haven't looked at it yet." She pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen the way people do when they're reminding themselves they have somewhere more important to be. "I was told you were the person to call. I want to understand why 3 certified technicians in Toronto, 2 in Mississauga, and 1 in Barrie couldn't find the fault in 11 days." Grant walked toward the car. "How much did that cost you?" A pause. "Close to $400,000 between the diagnostics, the parts replacements, and 2 tows." He crouched down beside the passenger front wheel and looked at the undercarriage, said nothing for a moment. Then, "And it still won't start." "It starts," she said, "for approximately 40 seconds. Then it cuts out and throws a code. The same code every time, regardless of what's been replaced." He stood up. "Which code?" She unlocked her phone and read it to him. He nodded slowly, the way a man does when something that had been vague begins to take shape in the back of his mind. "Leave it with me," he said. "How long?" He looked at the car again. Really looked at it. Something in his expression shifted. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of attention that had been dormant for a while and was now awake. "Come back at 4. The garage had been his wife's idea. That was the part Grant never told people. When they asked how he ended up in Collingwood running a 2-bay shop after 12 years as a powertrain systems engineer at a Tier 1 automotive supplier in Windsor, he usually said something about wanting a change of pace, wanting to raise their daughter somewhere with a backyard and actual seasons. All of that was true. But the original idea, the garage, the small town, the slower life, had come from Renata. She had drawn it on a napkin once, over dinner in Windsor when they were both exhausted and a little bit hopeful. A small building, a modest sign, a town she'd pointed to on a map of Ontario, and said looked like a place where a person could breathe. She'd been sick by then, though they hadn't known it yet, not really known it. He'd opened the garage 14 months after she died. His daughter, Maya, was 11 now, and doing better than he probably deserved credit for. She was at school 6 minutes away, and she walked home at 3:30 and let herself in through the side door and started her homework at the kitchen table like clockwork. She was independent in the way children of quiet, grief-carrying parents often became. Perceptive, self-sufficient, occasionally more patient with him than he was with himself. The shop did fine. It did better than fine, actually. Once word spread that Grant knew things about German engineering that most technicians in a 200-kilometer radius didn't. He wasn't cheap. He wasn't fast. But he was accurate in a way that mattered more than both of those things. He had turned down the Ashworth job when the assistant first called. He'd been booked out 6 weeks, and he didn't like taking on work he couldn't give proper attention to. But the assistant had called back the next day, and the day after that, and on the 4th call it had been Victoria Ashworth herself, brief and direct and not particularly warm, who said that she'd been told he was the best in the region, and that she needed the best and was prepared to compensate accordingly. He'd said he'd look at it. He hadn't said anything more than that. The code, when he pulled it up on his own diagnostic system, was a communication fault between the engine control module and the high-voltage junction box. Every technician before him had read the same code and done the logical thing. They'd replaced the parts it pointed to: module, junction, harness segments. One of them had apparently replaced the entire wiring loom on the high side at a cost that made Grant set down his coffee. And the car still cut out at 40 seconds. Every single time. Grant pulled on his gloves and started from the beginning. Not from the code, from the car. He'd learned this from a man named Roy Fischel, who'd run a shop in Leamington and who had worked on everything from Ferraris to farm equipment for 4 decades. Roy used to say that a code tells you where the patient is hurting. It doesn't tell you why. You have to go looking for the why yourself, and you have to go looking slowly, because the car will tell you if you let it. Grant let it. He went through the grounding points first, all 17 of them on a car of this generation, checking resistance by hand with a meter, not relying on the system's self-diagnostic. Most people skip this step because the car's own software could theoretically flag a grounding issue. Theoretically. On the 9th ground point, tucked behind the left rear suspension mount in a location that required removing a panel, most technicians didn't know existed, he found it. Not a failed ground. Something more subtle, and in its way, more maddening. The terminal had been reseated at some point, at the factory, or during an early service. It was impossible to know, and it had been reseated at an angle so slight it was invisible to the eye. Under normal operating temperature, the contact held. But at 40 seconds of running, when the surrounding metal reached operating temperature and expanded by fractions of a millimeter, the tolerance closed and the contact broke and the car died. Every time. 40 seconds. Same code. $400,000 in 11 days, and nobody had pulled that panel. Grant sat back on his heels in the quiet of the garage and felt something he hadn't felt in a while. Not satisfaction. Not quite. Something older than that. The particular calm of understanding a thing that has resisted being understood. He corrected the ground, cleaned the terminal, reseated it properly, and applied the torque spec from memory. Then he started the car. It idled past 40 seconds without a tremor. Past a minute, past 2. He let it run for 20 minutes, then shut it off and started it again. He did this 3 more times. Then he called the number the assistant had given him. Victoria Ashworth arrived at 4:05 in the same Escalade. She came into the garage without waiting to be invited, which he respected, and she looked at the Porsche sitting quietly with its hood closed and said nothing for a moment. "It's done," Grant said. She looked at him. "It's fixed." "Yes." She waited as though expecting him to continue. When he didn't, something shifted in her expression. Not softening, exactly, but a kind of recalibration. She was a woman who was accustomed to receiving information in detailed, structured form, and Grant had given her 2 words. "What was it?" she said. He told her. He told her precisely, in technical language, because he'd learned over the years that people either wanted the simple version or the real version, and Victoria Ashworth had not struck him as someone who wanted things simplified. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "A ground terminal," she said. "Yes. That's it. That's it." She looked at the car. He watched her process it, the 11 days, the $400,000, the team of certified specialists, all of it set against one misaligned terminal behind a panel nobody pulled. He could see the exact moment she arrived at the conclusion, because her expression didn't change and yet something behind it did. "Why did you find it?" she said, when they didn't. It wasn't quite a question. It was something closer to a challenge, not hostile but real. She wanted an actual answer. Grant thought about Roy Fischel. He thought about 12 years of working with engineers who trusted the diagnostic software over their own hands. He thought about the fact that on a car like this, at this level of complexity, the system only knew what it had been programmed to look for. "I went looking for things the code couldn't see," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked around the garage, the clean organization of it, the hand-labeled shelves, the worn but cared-for tools, the small framed photo of a girl in a hockey jersey on the workbench near the window. She looked at all of it differently than she had that morning. "Your rate?" she said. He told her. She didn't flinch. "That's for the repair?" "That's for the time." She nodded. Then, after a pause, "Who trained you?" It was the first question she'd asked that had nothing to do with the transaction. They ended up talking for almost an hour, not because Grant was a particularly talkative person. He wasn't. But because Victoria Ashworth, it turned out, was someone who asked precise questions and actually listened to the answers, and Grant had not had a conversation like that in longer than he could easily remember. She'd grown up in Hamilton, the daughter of a machinist. She knew what a torque spec was. She knew what a wiring loom looked like. She had gone into finance because the money was in finance, but she'd grown up in a house that smelled like machine oil, and the memory of it had never entirely left her. Grant made coffee, the real kind, from a press, which he kept in the garage because the garage was where he spent most of his time, and they stood near the open bay door as the light outside went the particular shade of gray that November afternoons went in this part of the country. And they talked about cars, and about work, and about the specific loneliness of being a person who was good at something that other people didn't have the language to understand. She did not talk about her personal life, and he did not ask. He did not talk about Renata, and she did not ask. But there was something in the conversation, some quality of mutual recognition, that didn't require any of that. At 5:30, he heard the side door of the house open and close, which meant Maya was done with homework and curious about the unfamiliar vehicle in the lot. She appeared in the bay door a moment later, backpack still on, looking at Victoria Ashworth with the direct assessment of a child who has learned to evaluate new people quickly and without sentimentality. "This is Maya," Grant said. "My daughter." "Hello," Maya said, looking at the Porsche. "Is that yours?" "It is," Victoria said. Maya walked around it slowly, the way Grant did, looking at it the way he'd taught her to look at things, not at the surface, but at the whole. "It was broken," she said. It wasn't a question. It was. "Dad fixed it?" "He did." Maya looked at her father with an expression that was fond and matter-of-fact in equal measure, as though this was simply the expected outcome of the universe operating correctly. "He's good at that," she said, and went inside to make herself a snack. Victoria watched her go. Then she looked at Grant with an expression he couldn't quite read. "She's confident," Victoria said. "She's had to be." A pause. Victoria looked at the coffee in her hand. "I'm sorry about her mother." He hadn't told her. He didn't know how she knew, or whether she'd simply concluded it from the shape of things. The single photo on the workbench, the way Maya had the self-possession of a child who had learned early that some absences are permanent. Either way, he didn't mind. It was the truth, and he had learned that the truth, stated plainly, was easier to hold than the careful management of it. "She was the one who wanted to move here," he said. "She drew it on a napkin. A shop like this, in a town like this." Victoria looked at the garage around them, at the sign he'd painted himself, at the layout Renata had sketched in pencil on a paper placemat at a Thai restaurant in Windsor 8 years ago, and which he had followed almost exactly when he built this place. "She had good taste," Victoria said. The Porsche left just after 6. Grant watched the Escalade pull out of the lot and turn onto the county road and disappear into the gray evening. He stood in the door of the garage for a moment after it was gone, in the cold and the quiet, with the smell of oil and cold air, and the last of the coffee going stale in the press. He thought about what 11 days and $400,000 looked like. He thought about what a misaligned terminal looked like. He thought about the gap between those two things, and how wide it was, and how easy it was to stand on the wrong side of it if you were looking at the code instead of the car. He went inside and helped Maya with the last of her homework. A short answer section on the water cycle that she didn't need his help with, but asked for anyway. He suspected, because she knew he needed the company, and he made dinner. And after Maya went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the house, with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. He thought about Roy Fischel, who had died 3 years ago in Leamington, and who had told him once that the most expensive problems are always the ones where everyone looked for something complicated, and the answer was something simple that nobody bothered to check. He thought about Renata and the napkin and the town she'd pointed to on a map. He looked out the window at the dark lot and the dark shape of the garage and the 2 bay doors he'd built with his own hands, and he thought that she would have liked today. Not the money, not the car. She would have liked the part where it ran. 3 weeks later, a call came in from a number he didn't recognize. It was a man named Elliot Strang, the head of fleet operations for a commercial logistics company out of Barrie. He said he'd gotten Grant's name from a colleague. He had 7 vehicles with a recurring fault that 3 different shops had failed to resolve, and he was prepared to bring all 7 of them to Collingwood if Grant could look at them. Grant asked what kind of vehicles. Strang told him. Grant looked at his calendar, full, as it usually was now, in a way it hadn't been 2 years ago. Send me the fault codes first, Grant said. All 7. And the service records. Of course, Strang said. Then, after a pause, we were told you find things other shops miss. Grant looked out through the bay window at the county road, at the sky above the trees going the particular shade of blue that meant the temperature was about to drop and the first real snow of the season was coming. Sometimes, he said, depends on what you're looking for. He hung up and stood for a moment in the quiet of the garage. Then he got back to work. The snow came the next morning. The first serious snow of the year, the kind that settled and stayed, that changed the sound of the town and made everything quieter and more itself. Maya came through the side door at 7:45 with snow in her hair and her cheeks red from the cold, and the particular look she got when the first snow came, which was a look Grant recognized because it had been Renata's look too. A private happiness at wintry things, at the quality of light on white ground, at the way the world simplified itself when it was covered in something clean and uniform. He had a car in the bay and a full day ahead of him. He poured Maya's cereal and her juice and got her backpack by the door and watched her walk up the road towards school through the new snow, small against the white landscape, unhurried. The fault codes from Elliot's Strang had come in overnight. He'd read them twice already, at 5 in the morning with his first coffee, and the shape of the problem had already begun to emerge in the particular way it always did. Not all at once, not in a flash of insight, but slowly, like something far away becoming gradually less far. He went into the bay and put his gloves on and started from the beginning, not from the code, from the car. The smallest fault in a system is very rarely the one the system knows to name. Most of the time, it's older than that, and quieter, and it's been there since before anyone thought to look. The people who find it are not always the most credentialed. They're not always the most expensive. They're the ones who go looking for the thing nobody checked, in the place nobody thought to look, with hands steady enough and patient enough to find it. Grant Mercer had been that person for a long time. He had built a garage in a small town in the Ontario Hills because a woman he loved had drawn it on a napkin, and he had learned his work from a man in Leamington who trusted his hands more than the screen, and he had a daughter who walked home through the snow at 3:30 and did her homework without being asked, and none of that was remarkable in a way that anyone would write about. But it was real, and the work was real, and in the cold, when the metal contracted and the tolerance closed and the margin disappeared, that was the only thing that mattered.